When rendering in After Effects, there's not a whole lot of render settings to keep track of other than, say, the resolution and your video codec. But in Cinema 4D, there's quite a few more things to pay attention to and check before you render. And if you want to go and access your render settings, we can click on this button right here or hit Command or Control B to bring up those render settings. So always keep track in the bottom left here, and you'll see what the shortcut keys are for any option you hover over, or if you hover your cursor over long enough, it'll show up right there as well. So it's always helpful to memorize these shortcut keys as you start to learn Cinema 4D and get more familiar. So what I'm going to do in this video is cover some of the most common render settings in Cinema 4D that will help ensure your renders look awesome. So let's start out with the Output tab here. And this is where you set up a lot of things like your resolution, your frame rate, and which frames you want to render. So what I'm going to do here is you can choose a bunch of different presets by clicking and holding on this little drop down menu here. And you can see under film and video, there's a bunch of different presets here. So we can do HD 1080, 29.97, and you can see that that changed our resolution right there. Now, if we want to choose lock ratio, what this is going to do is lock the ratio here. So this is 16:9. So if I wanted to go 4K, I can type in 3840, and that will then automatically update the height to 2160. So super handy. Resolution, you really don't have to change unless you're doing stuff for print. And then your frame rate here is very important. Now you can see this option here, use project frame rate, is checked on. So if you want to change your frame rate, what you're going to do is do that in your project settings. And to access your project settings, we're going to hit Command or Control D, and then here in the Scene tab is where you can set the frames per second. Now, one word of advice for you is that if you know you're going to be rendering at a certain frame rate, be sure you set this from the get-go. So if you know that your animation is going to be at 24 frames per second, definitely do this before you do any keyframing, because you can see this just updated everything. And if I go to my timeline and zoom in here, you can see I have frames that aren't actually on a single keyframe. They're kind of in the middle. And this is because we totally changed the frame rate and we changed where our keyframes are actually happening at. So again, always highly recommend that you set this from the get-go and then add your keyframes, or it can kind of throw everything off. Now, another thing we can do in this render setting window is choose what frame range we want to use. So right now, it's just going to use the current frame. So if I go to say frame 29, it's only going to render this frame, okay? So if you want to render in the entire animation, what you're going to do is go all frames, and that's going to render from frame 0 to frame 90. You can see frame 90, you can see down here, that is the length of our animation currently, 90 frames. Now under this Save tab, this is where you just define where you want to save your image. And you can choose all different types of formats. I highly recommend you choose a image sequence and not an MP4 or any of these other types of movie formats, because if you say need to re-render frames, or you need to cancel a render, or your computer crashes, which never happens, right? If your render is only halfway done and you render using a movie format, that file is going to be unusable. Compare that with if you're rendering using an image sequence. If your computer crashes for whatever reason, you can open back up your file and then resume from whatever the last frame was that Redshift rendered before your computer crashed. So I like to use PNG, and then with certain file formats, you can increase the depth. So I'll choose 16 bits for channel. If you need an alpha channel, this is where you can turn on those things as well. Multipass we'll cover a little bit later, but I'll uncheck that for now. And if you're going to do any compositing inside of After Effects, you can do stuff like that. And here, I highly recommend you check out some of the content on Cineversity that covers compositing project files inside of After Effects. You can export things like lights and positions of nulls, so you can do a lot of compositing inside of After Effects. But the one thing we're going to worry about here is just choosing where we're going to save our file. So I'll just save here, and we'll just do test. And you can see there is our file path that our animation is going to render at. Next is Magic Bullet Looks, which again we'll cover in a later video. But the next most important tab in here is Redshift. And this is all of your Redshift render settings. Now there's basic and advanced. So if I click over to advanced, you can see the whole mess of stuff that is available for you. Again, highly recommend you check out Redshift specific videos on Cineversity if you really want to deep dive on all of the Redshift render settings here. But for now, we're just going to stick with the basic tab, and you can see we can turn on denoising here, and then we can also choose the bucket quality, which is basically how much grain do you want to have in your render. This is kind of like a grain tolerance. So the lower the bucket quality, the more amount of grain. The higher the bucket quality, the less grain, but the longer the render you're going to have. So low is going to have faster render, more grain. High is going to be slower render, less grain, because it's calculating and removing a lot of that grain. But since we have denoising on, it does a really good job of denoising images. So I'm just going to leave that at medium. Progressive passes just relates to what's happening in our preview view here, not our final render. And right here is where you can turn on motion blur if you want to do something like that. Steps is just how many calculations it's going to take to determine the motion blur. So if you have a lot of arcing movements or fast moving blurs, or if you have any blur that is going to happen from deformations, like our bend deformers are deforming our arms, so that's a deformation blur. So you're going to want to turn that on if we want to render motion blur for this piece right here. Motion blur, of course, is going to add more render time to calculate that kind of thing. Global illumination is basically calculating bounce light, and that's on by default. Caustics is just going to render more accurate glass, which we could turn on for this, but it's going to increase the render times as well. So we'll skip that for now. And then this is how many passes are used to calculate light bounces through things. So if I twirl this down, you can see global illumination, reflection, refraction, how many passes are happening here. So if you have a lot of transparent objects, one over the other, you're going to want to up some of these settings here. And this hardware ray tracing is just going to optimize for any ray tracing capability your setup might have on your end. So that being said, let's say we're happy with our render settings. We're going to save out. We got our output all set up, and we're going to start rendering an entire animation. And so to set off a render, we're going to close out of our render settings. We're going to go and click and hold on this little clapper with the play button. And this is our render to picture viewer, which is going to render the picture viewer, which is also going to render images to your computer as well. You can see the shortcut key for that is Shift R. So once we fire that up, you can see we have our picture viewer. And again, this is basically going to allow you to see your render as it's calculating. So you can see the progress down here, each frame. So you can see it's rendering frame 1 of 91 frames. You can see we're not totally seeing our entire composition. We're rendering at 4K, so it's going to be a big image. So if we want to scale this down, we can see all of our image now. And so you can see our buckets working away here, doing our final render. And with one frame done, you can see the render time, the resolution, and if you right click, you can go and show file and explore and see exactly where that image is. There it is. I'll just preview it, and there is our final render that rendered to our folder that we set up in our render path. Now to speed up this render, what we can do is stop this, and it's going to say the external render is calculating an image. Do you want to stop? And I'm going to say yes. And what we can do is we can go to our settings and change the bucket quality to low. And if we twirl this down, this is going to give us our threshold. And again, this is a threshold tolerance for grain. So the higher this number, the more grain, the faster the render. The lower this threshold, you can see that it goes to the very high, it's going to have less grain but longer render time. So you can really push this with the denoising, especially the denoiser does a really great job. And to compare that 2-minute per frame render, let's bring this up to 0.3, so very high threshold, and let's just go ahead and try again. And you're going to see we already have that one image already rendered, so we're prompted here to choose what we want to do. Do we want to render and overwrite? Do we want to render without saving the images? Or do we only want to render the 90 missing frames? And since we're using different render settings, we just want to render all and write over that existing frame. So I'll hit OK. And let's see how long this will take with the updated settings. So one thing I wanted to point out, you can see the denoising happening as it's going around. So it gets grainy and then clears up. Super cool to watch. So there you go. We just cut our render time by more than half of the original amount here. 2 minutes, 22 seconds down to just under a minute. And one of the cool things about the picture viewer is you can compare a frame to another frame. So if I look at this frame, that's our frame that took 2 minutes and 22 seconds. If I click on this, you can see it updates and there's no change whatsoever, which is really interesting. Another way we can do this is A/B testing. And so to A/B compare, what we can do is right click and set as A, and then right click on the other image and set as B. And you can see there's this line now. And so now if we hover over that line, you'll get the up and down arrows. And if we go back and forth, you can see we are toggling through both images. And you can see as I'm going through here, really no change at all. So definitely play around with render settings and see what you can do to optimize your render. And again, if you want to dive even deeper into Redshift render settings, definitely check out the Redshift render series on Cineversity. You can really dive deep into all of these other ways to render and also optimize your renders as well.